The timer on the instrument panel was useless. The altimeter, however, was unwinding like a clock racing toward a terminal hour. 18,000 feet, 17,500, 17,000. The air screamed past the canopy, not with the song of a high-speed dive, but with a tearing, buffeting shriek, the sound of air losing its mind. Below him, the Mojave Desert was a dizzying canvas of brown and sage, snapping from vertical to inverted, then dissolving into a gray blur. The P-38 Lightning, a machine built for speed and altitude, was now behaving like a broken toy. It tumbled, resisted, and defied every law of physics taught in the Army Air Force curriculum. The yoke was dead wood in his hands, fighting back with a brutal, sickening shudder. He had applied full right rudder, the textbook solution, the instinct drilled into every pilot since the biplane era. It did nothing. Worse, the rudder seemed to have accelerated the tumble into a terrifying, flat rotation, a death spiral from which the aircraft was famously, fatally, unrecoverable. An 18-year-old cadet, just hours into advanced fighter training, had 10 seconds left to live. Perhaps less, unless the solution lay not in fighting the spin, but in the very heart of the chaos itself. The year was 1943. The war was expanding faster than doctrine could adapt, and the P-38 Lightning was a stark illustration of that failure. Its silhouette was unmistakable. Two elongated engine booms carrying the massive Allison V-1710 engines, flanking a central nacelle housing the cockpit and heavy armament. With its tricycle landing gear, it looked like a visitor from the future. It was a twin-engine interceptor built for speed and high altitude, a formidable weapon, but it carried a lethal, inherent flaw. The statistic: across the training centers, accidents climbed every month. The P-38 had a reputation as a widowmaker. Once it entered a high-speed, accelerated stall, it snapped into a spin without warning. If that spin lasted more than 2 rotations, instructors gave the only advice the doctrine allowed: bail out. The aircraft was expendable. The pilot was not. The problem was structural. Lockheed engineers knew the twin-boom configuration introduced complexities no one fully understood. In a standard single-engine fighter, a spin is violent but relatively predictable, a nose-down rotation around a vertical axis, with the fuselage acting as a pivot. The prescribed recovery, opposite rudder to stop rotation, push the yoke forward to break the stall, was a universal truth. This method was drilled into every cadet, a muscle memory passed down since the Great War. But the P-38 defied this truth entirely. Its center of gravity was positioned uniquely between 2 powerful engines, far from the central nacelle. In a spin, this configuration created an extreme aerodynamic asymmetry. Instead of a predictable rotation, one boom would rise sharply while the other fell, inducing a terrifying, resisting, tumbling motion. The rudder, mounted on the central boom, quickly lost all effective authority as airflow separated, while the elevators, essential for breaking the stall, were often shielded by the turbulent, spinning airframe itself. Pilots were dying because the very instincts they were trained on, pulling back on the yoke or applying full opposite rudder, sometimes accelerated the tumble into an inverted flat spin. This state was deemed completely unrecoverable, the final, fatal gesture of a complex design. Lockheed engineers had issued handling guidance: avoid low-speed maneuvering, never pull more than 4 Gs below 250 indicated airspeed, and if a spin develops, bail out if recovery doesn't begin in 3 seconds. They were, to their credit, honest. They did not fully understand the exact vortex dynamics locking the aircraft into rotation. The solution was avoidance. Avoid spins, avoid fighting, avoid flying the P-38 to its theoretical limits. This constraint meant the aircraft could not be flown aggressively against the highly maneuverable Japanese Zero or the German Messerschmitts, constraining its turn performance by fear as much as by physics. This deadly frontier brought the cadets to Muroc Army Airfield. Among them was Ralph Hoffer, born in Salem, Missouri, in 1924. He was not a typical military recruit seeking glory. He was a farm kid with a mind wired for systems. The protagonist's unique trait: Ralph learned to drive a tractor at 9, not just operating it, but tearing down and rebuilding the carburetor when it flooded. By 14, he could diagnose engine misfires by sound alone. His father's modest farm survived the Depression through sheer frugality and the ability to repair anything. Ralph inherited that trait. He saw complex systems, engines, hydraulics, aerodynamics, not as mysteries but as puzzles with knowable solutions. When a neighbor's truck lost its brakes, Ralph rigged a temporary hydraulic bypass using a bicycle pump and copper tubing, a solution of mechanical logic overriding panic. He enlisted at 17, his birth certificate conveniently vague. Ground school fascinated him. He didn't memorize Bernoulli's principle. He sketched diagrams, annotating stall angles and pressure differentials, instinctively understanding the why behind the lift. His smoothness on the controls during primary training wasn't luck. It was mechanical logic translated into flight. At Muroc, Ralph approached the P-38 the same way he approached a tractor engine. He walked the flight line before dawn, asking crew chiefs about turbocharger operation, coolant flow, and magneto timing. He knew they understood the aircraft in ways pilots never could. He felt the P-38's stiffness, the slight yaw of its throttles, and the way it resisted roll inputs at low speed, building a precise mental map of its flight envelope. But no one had taught him what to do when that envelope collapsed. The official line was uncompromising. In combat theaters, pilots who attempted to yank and bank the Lightning into a tight turning fight frequently entered spins. After-action reports were cautious. Aircraft lost during combat maneuvering, cause undetermined. The training commands circulated the warnings, drilling avoidance into the young men. Do not exceed the Lightning's turn envelope. Yet the mechanics knew something the briefing rooms did not. On the flight line, crew chiefs compared notes, seeing patterns in wreckage reports. Spin entries always happened during aggressive maneuvering, often a stall at low airspeed. Once inverted, the machine refused all corrective action. Ralph Hoffer read the incident reports. He saw the pattern. But he also noticed something else in the precious few survival accounts that occasionally surfaced. The pilots who did manage to live, the ones who defied the odds, described an action that was completely antithetical to every instinct and lesson. They stopped fighting the controls. They waited. And sometimes, the Lightning, on its own accord, would arrest the terrifying tumble and begin to fall nose down, sorting itself out. Ralph filed that detail away. It was a quiet, revolutionary hypothesis against the established, bloody doctrine of the U.S. Army Air Force. It was the only crack in the system, suggesting that the physics of the aircraft, if trusted, might offer a brief, critical moment of salvation. Before we meet the cadet who dared to test this anomaly and deliberately break the rules, tell us your take on this impossible situation, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Do you think a solution exists when the manual says, surrender? Ralph Hoffer was 19, but he carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent his life diagnosing failures in heavy machinery. His enrollment was not driven by the typical rush for wartime glory, but by an analytical compulsion to understand the most complex machine he had ever encountered, the P-38. He saw equations not as theoretical constructs, but as mechanical descriptions of reality. His physics teacher once noted his inherent intuition for forces, leverage, momentum, and friction. He did not rely on rote memorization of formulas. He understood the underlying principles, why the formulas worked. This approach defined his flight training. In the Stearman biplanes of primary training, he soloed after only 7 hours. His instructor praised his smoothness on the controls, which was simply Ralph feeling the aircraft through vibration and sound, instinctively maintaining harmony between the propeller pitch, the stick, and the rudder. During aerobatics, he managed energy with precision, converting altitude into speed and back without squandering momentum. In formation flying, he held position without the slightest drift, treating his plane like a precisely calibrated gear in a larger system. The P-38 Lightning at Muroc was a different species entirely. It was twice the weight, exponentially more powerful, and dangerously complex. Ralph's education shifted from the briefing room to the flight line. Most cadets saw the mechanics as support staff, but Ralph treated them as the true custodians of the aircraft's inner workings. He would arrive before dawn, watching the crew chief service the twin Allison V1710 engines. He asked specific technical questions about turbocharger operation, coolant flow across the booms, and magneto timing, details that were beyond the scope of a pilot's training syllabus. The crew chiefs liked him because he truly listened, recognizing that their greasy hands held the deepest, most pragmatic knowledge of the Lightning's operational boundaries. Ralph flew his first P-38 sortie on a cold January morning. The power was immense, the takeoff run eternal, the nose high until the tricycle gear lifted. Then, the dual Allison engines sang. He didn't just fly the plane, he internalized its feedback. He felt the slight, inherent stiffness of the airframe, the way it resisted roll inputs at low speed, and the complex yaw created when throttling up one engine before the other. This rigorous mental mapping of the Lightning's responses across its flight envelope was crucial, because he was acutely aware that the envelope itself was partially uncharted and fundamentally flawed. The inherent problem of the Lightning, which no amount of pilot skill could overcome, was its revolutionary twin-boom design. In a standard stall, the aircraft needed clean air flowing over the central control surfaces for recovery. In the P-38, however, the twin-boom structure created aerodynamic asymmetry that aggressively amplified mistakes. A slight stall at the edge of the turn envelope would cause the aircraft to snap into rotation. The center of gravity, situated between the two engines, far from the central control column, meant that in a spin, one boom would climb while the other fell. This created a turbulent, tumbling motion that resisted all conventional inputs. The controls themselves became useless. The rudder, essential for rotation correction, lost all authority as the airflow separated. The elevators, mounted on the central tail section, became shielded by the massive, spinning airframe. Applying the standard recovery technique, full opposite rudder and forward stick, often made the situation worse, transitioning the aircraft from a somewhat unstable spin into a fully inverted flat spin, from which the aircraft was definitively irrecoverable and fatal. Lockheed's engineers acknowledged the danger with cautious guidance. Avoid low-speed maneuvering below 10,000 tower and F2. But this avoidance was a constraint, a silent admission that the fastest, highest-flying fighter in the inventory could not fight on equal terms with lighter, nimbler aircraft like the Japanese Zero, which excelled in turning fights. Ralph read the incident reports meticulously, not with dread, but with clinical detachment. He focused on the mechanics, seeing patterns of wreckage scattered across the Mojave, spins initiated during aggressive turns, usually a hard pull at low airspeed, resulting in a wing stall. The aircraft would snap inverted and begin tumbling. He knew the doctrine, bail out. But he also knew of the handful of surviving pilots who had been too slow to act, who had stopped fighting the controls in paralyzing panic, and who had, against all odds, lived. Their accounts were often dismissed as luck or faulty reporting. Ralph saw something else. Data. The key detail: these pilots had released the yoke, neutralizing the controls, essentially surrendering to the spin. The P-38's design, though structurally flawed in its spin characteristics, also dictated that the aircraft, like any other object, would seek its most aerodynamically stable position, which was nose down, engines first, falling into a clean airflow. Fighting the spin with rudder or aileron inputs violently disrupted this natural transition. By doing nothing, the pilot potentially allowed the airframe's natural tendency to reassert itself, dropping the nose and restoring critical airflow over the control surfaces. It was counterintuitive. Every primal instinct, every hour of training, dictated fight. But Ralph's mind, wired for the elegant logic of systems, realized that the solution might be the complete opposite. Patience. He filed this anomaly away, understanding that one survival could be luck. But repeated observation suggested a hidden mechanical truth. He needed to verify this truth, and the only way to do that was to deliberately commit the fatal mistake at altitude. It happened on a Tuesday. The California sky was a high, brilliant blue, the air crisp and light. Ralph Hoffer was flying solo aerobatics at 18,000 feet, a solitary silver streak above the vast empty canvas of the Mojave. His mission profile called for practicing loops, rolls, and Immelman turns. But today, Ralph had a different objective. He was not training. He was experimenting. He needed to find the exact point where the P-38's flight envelope collapsed, and then he needed to survive it. He began by practicing energy management, trading speed for altitude, feeling the boundaries of the aircraft with meticulous care. At 250 knots indicated airspeed, he decided to initiate a slow roll. The input was smooth, precise application of the aileron, designed to rotate the horizon in a controlled manner. He held the roll, inverted, the desert below spinning slowly into his vision, but his speed bled off faster than he had anticipated. The nose dropped. He corrected, instinctively pulling back on the yoke to lift the nose and prevent an accelerated stall. It was too much back pressure. In that critical instant, the airflow separated violently from the wing. The P-38 snapped left. The world dissolved into a chaos of noise and motion. The rotation was sickening, immediate and overwhelming. The G-forces slammed him sideways in his harness, wrenching his inner ear. The instrument panel, the sky, the desert. They tumbled together in a violent, accelerating blur. His hands, operating on instinct honed by thousands of hours in primary trainers, immediately jammed the right rudder pedal. Full opposite rudder. Nothing happened. The spin didn't slow. It felt like it accelerated, locking the aircraft into a lethal, tumbling oscillation. The altimeter became his clock. 17,000 feet. 16,000 feet. The desert rushed up to meet him. Doctrine screamed at him. 2 rotations, then bail out. His right hand twitched, moving toward the canopy release handle. It was the only rational, survival-driven action. But in that fraction of a second, as the altimeter ticked past 15,500 feet, the rational voice was overridden by the quiet, analytical mind of the farm kid. He remembered the reports, the whispers of the wreckage, the accounts of the pilots who had done nothing. Let the aircraft tell you what it needs. It was the most counterintuitive choice of his young life. His entire body screamed, fight, correct, force. He ignored it all. He released the yoke. Neutral stick, neutral rudder. He pulled both throttles back to idle, silencing the twin Allison engines to a metallic sigh. The P-38 continued spinning. The noise, the turbulence, the sickening rotation. None of it stopped. He was falling. A piece of metal surrendering to gravity. And now he had no control inputs to halt the descent. He was utterly passive. 15,000 feet. 14,000 feet. The desert filled his vision, its contours becoming sharper, more menacing. He forced himself to wait, stomach knotted, sweat soaking his collar despite the cold altitude. The spin felt eternal, a violent, desperate eternity measured in lost thousands of feet. Then at approximately 13,500 feet he felt it. Not a sudden stop, but a subtle, seismic shift in the aircraft's attitude. The nose dipped lower. The flat, tumbling spin began to transition into a steeper, more controlled spiral. The lightning seeking its natural engine's forward trajectory. The rotation slowed, perceptibly, as the nose dropped and the airframe found a slightly cleaner angle to the wind. He didn't move. He continued to wait, letting the massive twin-engine structure fall freely, building speed. As the nose pointed toward the Earth, the airspeed indicator began to flutter, then climb. Critical airflow was returning. The rudder, once uselessly buffered by the turbulence, was beginning to regain its authority. Only then, when he felt the solidity of the controls return, did Ralph act. He applied gentle opposite rudder. The rotation stopped instantly. He eased back on the yoke, steadily, carefully, managing the building G-forces. The horizon leveled. He was flying again. His hands shook, his breathing ragged, but his mind was already shifting from survival to clinical analysis. He checked his altitude, 11,000 feet. He had lost 7,000 feet in the spin and recovery, an extreme loss, but he was alive. If he had been lower, he would be a smear on the Mojave floor. Ralph leveled off and circled the high-altitude training area, his pulse slowing, his mind replaying the sequence with surgical precision. He saw the mechanical logic clearly. The initial stall and snap roll entry, the acceleration of the spin when he added the standard opposite rudder, the textbook fight. The stabilization when he neutralized all controls, the surrender. The slow but inevitable transition from a flat, high-drag tumble to a nose-down spiral as gravity pulled the heavy engine booms forward. The return of airflow over the rudder and elevators allowing the controls to work again. The breakthrough was the pause. Fighting the spin disrupted the necessary aerodynamic transition, keeping the aircraft locked in a flat, unrecoverable attitude. Doing nothing allowed the aircraft's heavy, nose-forward structure to use gravity to break the high-drag stall, restoring the required airflow over the control surfaces. The solution was counterintuitive. You had to let go of control to regain it. He didn't report it immediately. One survival could be luck. He climbed back to 20,000 feet. He needed data. He needed to prove the theory. He deliberately stalled the aircraft into a spin again. Neutral controls. Idle throttles. Wait. The spin developed. He fell. 15 seconds. 20. Then the nose dropped. Airspeed built. Rudder authority returned. He recovered again. Ralph landed and sat in the cockpit, the silent victory echoing in the hollow fuselage. He knew the doctrine was written in blood. Now he had a procedure written in physics. He would not stop testing until he understood the precise mechanical logic. The whole system was wrong, but one 18-year-old trusted physics over fear, risking his life alone, twice, to verify a hypothesis. If you value stories of courage grounded in logic, hit that subscribe button now and join the thousands who are learning the forgotten lessons of history. Don't let these lives be forgotten. Over the next 2 weeks, Ralph dedicated his solo flight time to rigorously testing his discovery. He understood the stakes. Doctrine demanded he stop, but his own mechanical intuition demanded verification. His procedure was absolute. Enter spin, neutralize controls, reduce throttles to idle, and wait for the natural aerodynamic transition. He varied every conceivable entry condition. He entered spins from slow rolls, from aggressive snap turns, and from accelerated stalls. He tested high-altitude entries and lower-altitude recoveries. Every single time, the result was the same. The Lightning, after a terrifying period of passive descent, would transition from its flat, tumbling rotation to a nose-down spiral. Airflow would be restored. The spin would cease. He began to see the logic not as a fluke, but as an undeniable physical constant governed by the P-38's design. The complex twin-boom structure, which made the aircraft aerodynamically unstable in a spin, was simultaneously the key to its recovery. The aircraft didn't inherently want to spin. It wanted to obey gravity by falling nose first, engines pulling the center of mass toward clean airflow. Ralph methodically documented his findings: entry conditions, spin characteristics, altitude loss, and recovery procedures. The recovery altitude varied. Sometimes he lost 3,000 feet, sometimes 6,000 feet. But the outcome was certain. The solution wasn't force. It was surrender, followed by finesse. As his mastery of the recovery technique grew, Ralph discovered an advanced tactical application of the fatal flaw. In the moments just before the spin transitioned, when the nose had dipped, airspeed was building, and the controls were just beginning to regain authority. The P-38 was rotating slowly enough that he could manipulate the exit. A slight nudge of the rudder, applied just as the aircraft stabilized, could swing the nose left or right, effectively setting the recovery heading. He practiced it relentlessly. Enter a left spin, wait for the nose drop. Nudge right rudder, exit stabilize, now heading 90 degrees off his entry course. Then he pushed the boundary further, recovering at 180 degrees off his entry heading. He was using the unrecoverable spin as an improvised high-speed directional change. He was turning a lethal accident into a tactical maneuver, a rapid, controlled descent that dropped thousands of feet while simultaneously changing the aircraft's bearing. This was not a dogfighting tactic. It was an escape maneuver. If a P-38 pilot was bounced by an enemy fighter and forced into an aggressive turn that risked a spin, the pilot no longer had to choose between certain death and bailing out. They could execute a deliberate spin, drop out of the immediate fight in seconds, change their bearing wildly, and then recover out of sight at low altitude, ready to egress. Ralph mentioned his recovery technique casually to another cadet during a pre-flight conversation. The cadet's reaction was immediate disbelief, tinged with fear. "You're deliberately spinning a P-38?" the cadet whispered, looking around nervously. Ralph shrugged, his tone clinical. "I'm recovering from spins. There's a difference." The cadet immediately walked away, convinced Ralph was either dangerously reckless or suicidal. However, a crew chief overheard the exchange. The crew chief, recognizing the source of the persistent thump-thump of the P-38's counter-rotating props over the empty lake bed, immediately reported the conversation to a flight instructor. The instructor, a captain with combat time, summoned Ralph to a tense meeting. The instructor listened to Ralph's explanation of the technique. Neutral controls, idle power, wait for the nose to drop, gentle recovery. Without interrupting, the captain's face was grim. "Hoffer," he said, his voice low. "That contradicts every single spin recovery procedure in the manual. Every procedure written by Lockheed and the Air Force." "I know, Captain," Ralph said, calm and unwavering, "but it works. I have tested it repeatedly at altitude." The captain asked if Ralph had documented any of this. Ralph admitted he had been testing it solo, wanting to be sure before he risked anyone else's attention. The instructor ordered him to stop immediately. Deliberate spins violated training protocols and were grounds for washing out. If Ralph wanted to pursue this, he had to write a detailed report, submit it to the chief flight instructor, and allow the test pilots to evaluate it under controlled conditions. Ralph agreed, but his testing continued until the report was finished. He spent 3 nights writing, producing a document that was factual, clinical, and devoid of drama. He included detailed entry conditions, the shift from flat spin to nose-down spiral, the calculated average altitude loss data, and his reasoning. Neutralizing controls allowed the P-38 to transition, restoring critical airflow over the rudder and elevator, a state that fighting the controls actively prevented. He calculated a minimum safe recovery altitude of 8,000 feet above ground level, based on his trials. His data was compelling, his logic impeccable. He simply observed, experimented, and trusted logic over fear. Ralph Hoffer's report, precise and data-heavy, did what his instructor's admonishments could not. It demanded attention. The chief flight instructor read the document, which contained the entry conditions, recovery data, and the startling conclusion that the existing doctrine was fundamentally flawed, and immediately forwarded it to Lockheed's test pilot liaison stationed at Muroc. The civilian test pilot, a seasoned aviator named Milo Burcham, was a man whose career was built on pushing and charting the edge of the envelope. He summoned Ralph to a sterile briefing room, the cadet's meticulously written report lying between them on the table. Burcham had the authority of the manufacturer, and his questions were sharp, technical, and relentless. He asked Ralph to walk him through the procedure step by step: the moment of stall, the timing of neutralizing the controls, the feel of the transition, and the precise, gentle opposite rudder input required for the exit. Burcham inquired about every variable: left spins, right spins, entries from inverted flight. Ralph answered each query with the clinical specificity of an engineer who had logged the data himself. Burcham sat back, a long assessing silence filling the room. "You've been doing this solo, at altitude," Burcham finally stated, his voice flat. "Without a chase plane, without safety observers, deliberately putting yourself into a known fatal maneuver." Ralph nodded. "Yes, sir." Burcham didn't smile. "You're either very brave or very stupid, Hoffer. Maybe both. But if you're right, this could save dozens of pilots before the year is out." Burcham arranged an official demonstration flight. This was no longer unauthorized cadet experimentation. This was a formal test designed to validate or condemn the procedure. Ralph would fly as P-38 with an experienced test pilot in a chase plane, monitoring his every move and ready to confirm when or if Ralph bailed out. The location: high altitude over the desolate, dry lake bed, far from populated areas. The morning of March 9th was cold and clear. Ralph pre-flighted his Lightning with extra care, checking every control surface and throttle response. Burcham's briefing was concise and grim. Follow radio procedures, maintain the test altitude, and, if anything feels wrong, bail out. Don't be a hero. They climbed to 20,000 feet. Ralph radioed that he was beginning the test. He reduced power, pulled back on the yoke, and kicked the left rudder. The Lightning stalled and snapped into rotation. The horizon spun once, then twice. He released the controls. Idle throttles. He fell. The spin continued. 10 seconds. 15. Then the inevitable aerodynamic transition began. The nose dipped. The airflow returned. Ralph added gentle opposite rudder. The spin stopped. He recovered level at 13,000 feet. Burcham's voice crackled over the radio, calm and professional. "Clean recovery again. Procedure validated." Ralph repeated it, a right-hand spin, then a spin entering from inverted flight. Each time, the process worked flawlessly. The logic held. The neutralization of controls allowed the aircraft's inherent structure to use gravity to break the stall and regain control. After the 5th successful recovery, Burcham called the test off. "That's enough. Bring it home." Ralph descended, his hands steady, his theory proven under the strictest conditions. The system, once rigid and resistant, reacted with startling speed. Within 2 weeks of Ralph's successful demonstration, Lockheed issued a technical bulletin to every P-38 unit in the Army Air Forces. The bulletin did not mention Cadet Ralph Hoffer by name. It was simply an institutional acknowledgement of a critical life-saving discovery. It outlined the revised spin recovery procedure for the P-38 Lightning. Neutralize all controls immediately. Reduce throttles to idle. Allow the aircraft to transition to a nose-down attitude, the nose drop. Apply gentle opposite rudder to stop rotation. Ease out of the dive as airspeed builds. The bulletin mandated a minimum recovery altitude of 8,000 feet above ground level. Training commands immediately updated their syllabi. Spin recovery, once forbidden, became a supervised, compulsory part of advanced P-38 instruction. The results were measurable and immediate. Accident rates, while not eliminated, spins still killed pilots who entered too low, dropped significantly. Pilots who once would have accepted the doctrine of surrender now had a second, viable option rooted in physics. Lockheed never mentioned Ralph Hoffer by name in the bulletin. The institutional memory was fading, even as his trick saved lives across North Africa and the Pacific. If you want us to keep telling the stories of these forgotten heroes, like and subscribe to WW2 War Notes so these lives aren't forgotten. The new spin recovery procedure had a profound and subtle impact in the combat theaters. It was not merely a survival technique. It evolved into a tactical asset. P-38 pilots operating over New Guinea and North Africa, facing nimble, slow-turning opponents like the Zero and the Mi-109, began integrating the maneuver into their defense. Bounced by enemy fighters, a pilot could intentionally induce a controlled spin, executing Ralph's procedure. The lightning would instantly become a tumbling, descending mess to the enemy, dropping several thousand feet in seconds, while simultaneously changing its heading by 90 or even 180 degrees. Pursuing aircraft, trained only for conventional flight, would almost invariably overshoot the rapidly disappearing P-38 or lose sight of it entirely in the chaotic descent. The P-38 pilot, after the recovery at low altitude, could then egress cleanly. It was the ultimate brake maneuver, a desperate gamble that Ralph Hoffer had made predictable. The P-38, once constrained by the fear of the spin, was now a little less deadly to its own pilots and a little more evasive to its enemies. Ralph Hoffer graduated from advanced flight training in April 1943. He was deployed to England, assigned to the famed 4th Fighter Group, flying initial sorties in the heavy P-47 Thunderbolt before transitioning to the P-51 Mustang. He became known among his squadron mates for aggressive flying, pressing attacks when others broke off, and for an almost frightening lack of hesitation when pushing his aircraft to its absolute limits. His gun camera footage showed kills at ranges so close that debris from the enemy plane struck his Mustang's wings. Perhaps he wasn't fearless. Perhaps he simply understood risk differently. He had already found the answer to what happens when physics fails you. On July 2, 1944, over Oscherleben, Germany, Ralph Hoffer was leading his flight when his Mustang was hit by accurate flak from the ground. Witnesses saw him attempt a forced landing in the damaged fighter. The aircraft crashed. He did not survive. Ralph Hoffer was 20 years old. By the time of his death, he had been credited with 15 aerial victories, earning him the distinction of a double ace, though historians believe his true combat record was likely higher. His name appears on the wall of the missing at the Netherlands American Cemetery. His time on Earth tragically short. Ralph never wrote a memoir. He left no letters philosophizing about courage or innovation. His legacy was buried deep within the bureaucratic machine he had briefly, but fundamentally, changed. Post-war, his technique was refined and incorporated into training for the new generation of jet fighters. The principle of neutralizing controls to allow natural aerodynamic recovery became foundational in spin instruction across virtually all aircraft types. Test pilots developing recovery techniques for the swept-wing F-86 Sabre and later Century Series fighters cited the P-38 procedure as a key precedent. However, the institutional memory faded quickly. In 1952, the Air Force published a comprehensive study on fighter spin characteristics. The section discussing the P-38 included a footnote. It referenced a field procedure developed during wartime training that contradicted conventional doctrine but proved effective in practice. The footnote did not name Ralph Hoffer. The technique was simply part of the curriculum, its origin lost to bureaucracy and the rush of time, but the mechanics remembered. Old crew chiefs, retired and telling stories at reunions, remembered the farm kid who walked the flight line before dawn, sketching diagrams and thinking through problems no one else dared to touch. They remembered the single, unassuming line in a crew chief's logbook, dated March 1943. Cadet Hoare demonstrated spin recovery procedure, aircraft recovered without incident, technique recommended for evaluation. It was a single line that marked the moment one pilot's curiosity transformed lethal instability into survivable aerodynamics. Ralph Hoffer's ultimate contribution was not a kill count or a strategic bombing raid. It was a gift of time, the precious, critical seconds between panic and death, the altitude between instinct and impact. He proved that sometimes the bravest thing a pilot could do when the world spun out of control was nothing at all. Until the moment the physics allowed them to act, the P-38. Lightning is gone now, but its lesson, trust the physics. Wait for the transition. Let the aircraft tell you what it needs, remains the foundation of modern aviation safety. A single line in a dusty logbook is the only memorial for the man who saved hundreds of lives. If this story moved you, prove it by leaving a like and subscribing to WW2 War Notes, or tell us exactly why you won't subscribe in the comments. We want to hear it. Next time, we tell the unbelievable story of how a small-town pilot's wild maneuver outflew elite enemy aces in minutes. You won't want to miss that.